Together can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another episode in the programs, public interest program. And on this occasion, we continue to examine violence in Guyana, the origins of violence, the anatomy of violence. And I don't want to be historical, but we need to go back a bit in the past to understand what is taking place at present. And I think all of us were astonished, maybe outraged, on the 6th of March 2020, when some PPP rioters stoned the school bus on West Coast Babies. You know, in the middle of the day, in the middle of a school day, you know, who do you expect to be in a school bus other than school children in the middle of a Friday, midday on a Friday? And those of you who might not have connected the dots would know that incident, the stoning of a school bus by PPP rioters in West Coast of Beast, was a reminder of a similar incident, or maybe a legal or fatal incident earlier in our history, when during the disturbances 60 years ago, because this is the 60th anniversary of the disturbances, GAU agent threw a bomb into a school bus carrying the children of Bocas Sugar Estate officials at Lusignan on the East Coast, Demerara this time. And it killed a 13-year-old boy by the name of Godfrey Teixeira. Several other school children were injured. They were all children of estate officials. And they were innocent children going home from school in the afternoon on the 23rd of March, and the chap died. Or I should say was killed. So when you see things happening in Guyana nowadays, like in March 2020, just a few days after elections, many of the older folk will remember, yes, the PPP bombed the school bus on the 23rd of March 1964. So we need to examine the anatomy of violence to help to prevent the recurrence of this type of violence, especially against children, innocent school children. So when we speak of the disturbances, we're not speaking about some historical event that happened long, long ago. It is still in the mentality, in the mindset of the People's Progressive Party. And the disturbances were a violent episode in Guyanese history. And the PPP itself called it the Hurricane of Protest. They gave it that name, the Hurricane of Protest. You check the records in newspapers. It's not an invention by the press. It was the name that the PPP gave to the campaign of terror. You remember on our last session together, we said that the three main political parties at the time, the PPP, PNC, and United Force, had gone up to London. Well, every day they used to go up to London to discuss constitutional reform and the electoral system and independence. And the last visit was in October 1963, just a few months before the hurricane of protest was launched. And the decisions by the three leaders, Mr. Burnham, Mr. Jagger, and Mr. Dikyar, was for the British to provide a solution to this controversy, the nature of the electoral system. And the British did that. But having agreed that the British should resolve the controversy, the PPP disagreed with the decision the British made. That is, that the PR system should replace the first past the post system, that independence will only come after elections, and that the voting age would remain at 21, which is what the PNC and UF wanted and what the PPP did not want. So on our last session, I explained how the first past the post system worked. This is what they call the Usain Bolt system. Whoever first passed the post, he won. And this is what happened. That under the first past the post system, 1953, 1961, 1957, 1961, party, the PPP actually could win 42% of the vote and get 58% of the seats. And the opposition could win 58% of the votes and get 42% of the seats, more or less. That is the arithmetic of the first past the post system. That's why you see countries like Barbados, the one party winning all the seats, or Grenada, one party winning all the seats. So it is unbalanced. It does not ensure fair representation. But from 1964, we've had the PR system, which ensures fair representation. You win 48% of the vote, you get 48% of the seats. Nothing can be simpler. My friends, this is the situation that led to the disturbances. Because when the PPP, or when the spokesperson for the PPP got back, all hell broke loose, literally. And the government, PPP was the government. It was elected in 1961. So by 1964, it was in its third year. But the government set out to obstruct general elections under the PR system. It wanted to remain in office until 1965, and it wanted to get independence before new elections. And it decided to make the colony of British Guiana ungovernable. And they started by staging the Freedom March. One part of the march started at Charity in what is now Region 2. The other part started in Crabwood Creek in Region 6, and they converged in Georgetown. Okay, we've got that part covered. But what was the hurricane about? Soon after the march, which was held on the 9th of February, or which ended up at what is now Camp Ghana. In 1964, it was the Rifle Rangers used by the British Guiana Volunteer Force. So it was a big open field. And at that time, the leader of the PPP, the General Secretary of the PPP, addressed the marchers, and he announced this hurricane of protest. Soon afterwards, the Guyana Agriculture Workers Union, which was always aligned to the PPP, which always sought representation for the sugar workers, demanded the right to represent workers in the sugar industry. But at that time, the union, which represented the sugar workers, since 1939, that is for 25 years, was the Manpower Citizens Association. And it so happened that the president of the Manpower Citizens Association was also the president of the British Guiana Trade Union Congress. So you had a situation in which the PPP was appealing against the MPCA, and at the same time, the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association, which controls all of the estates, at that time there were just about 11 estates because sugar has been shrinking since the 19th century. It's always shrinking, it's still shrinking. And because of the control of the sugar industry by the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association, GAU's appeals fell on deaf ears. And the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association was not prepared to countenance GAU requests without evidence. The long and short of it is that soon after the hurricane of protests, violence started on the sugar estates, started on West Demerara at Leonora. And more or less between the 12th of February and the 25th of July, we've had continuous violence, mostly along the coast of what was then British Guiana. And you can see that this violence had, after a while, it had nothing to do with industrial issues. Nothing to do with wages and salaries and workers' compensation and so on. This was a campaign of terror, plain and simple. And despite the claims of Gao, the fact is that by February 1964, it was not the recognized union. So the strike that it called was technically a wildcat strike. But because of its violent actions, it tried to prevent workers from going to work. And of course, this led to deaths. In the next program, we'll examine the massacres because that is the first time people heard that word in Guyana since the 1823 rebellion, a massacre. And we'll deal with that on another occasion. But this time, we'll just look at violence that the Gao stimulated and ignited in the sugar estates. Okay, without calling a strike, we know that many workers stopped going to work. And Gao didn't call the strike officially. It didn't inform the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association that they were formally on strike until the 3rd of March. By the 4th of March, the next day, 2 sugar workers were killed when a bomb was placed in the vehicle, the truck, lorry, which was taking them on the quarantine course from Manchester to Tain. These persons belonged to the MPCA, and as far as they were concerned, their union did not call a strike. But the bomb was placed on the truck. It wasn't thrown in the truck, it was placed on the truck. And it was a time bomb because many of the bombs that exploded during 1964 were constructed in a similar way. And they were trained in a similar training school overseas. So all of the bombs tended to be time bombs. So when you hear a bomb going off in the Son Chapman launch, it was a time bomb. And the bomb that was placed in the truck, the Booker Sugar Estate trucks, exploded at Tain on the 4th of March, 1964, killed Edgar Munro and Ramraj Gunraj. So the killing started off with a balanced slate. And those of you who are interested could Google a song by a songster called Nesbit Changur. Nesbit Changur. And it's very interesting to listen to that song about Guyana. It's a lament, really. I think it's called the Guyana Lament. And you must listen to it. You realize how bitter life was in Guyana 60 years ago. And it was all because of the Gao's campaign of violence. So the killing started off with 1 African and 1 Indian. Now, why was there such violence? Sugar workers continued to work and they became victims of violence because that is how they earned their living. And they did not belong to the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union. Many of them belonged to the Manpower Citizen Association and had been members for several years. But the sugar workers at Leonora stopped working. That's in Region 3. And production ceased because the factories couldn't work because there was no sugar cane. But then violence started to spread along the coast, even to areas that were not involved in sugar production. The long and short is that the governor, there was a new governor, Sir Richard Luyt, Luyt. He's actually South African, so the name is probably Dutch origin, but he's a veteran from the Second World War. So he was different from the previous governor, Sir Ralph Gray. He understood security. I think when you serve in South Africa's government, you understand security very well, especially that time. And he came with a different mindset. And he declared a state of emergency a bit late in the day. I think he came in March, and I think after the Abraham family massacre. And I said, we'll deal with the massacres in our next episode, in our next edition of the Public Interest. The Abraham family was massacred on the 12th of June, and the next morning, the police arrested 32 members of the People's Progressive Party, including the deputy premier, um, and they sent them to Her Majesty's Penal Settlement, HMPS, at Mazaruni. There was a special section. It was not in the prison, but it was at Mazaruni, called Sibley Hall. So under the emergency regulations, these people, these PPP MPs and two PNC MPs were detained without trial. That was a real British invention, detention without trial. But it helped to ease some of the pressure, some of the violence that was taking place. And then another order was made under the emergency regulations by the governor, giving the army, police, and the court wider powers to deal with any offense which involved weapons. And that came particularly after another massacre, which we'll deal with, the Hurdaya massacre, which is probably the single worst massacre of human beings since the 1823 revolts. About 50 people were blown to bits in the Demerara River, but we'll deal with that. So the first thing we saw happening in response to the PPP terror was the declaration of the state of emergency by the governor. Secondly, the British Guiana police force started to deploy riot units. First of all, to Leonora, because by then, there's a lot of bomb throwing and missile throwing, even before Gao declared a strike. So the police canceled leave from the same 4th of March, so no policeman could proceed on leave, and they began patrolling the roadway, particularly in West Coast Demerara, mostly between Stewartville and Metten-Meersarg. I think the residents of West Demerara have names for it, but it was like running a gauntlet, because you go into one village that was friendly, then the next village you'll be attacked. Similarly, people traveling on the train between Parika and Breeden Hoop, when the train stopped at the station, many people would attack if you were one persuasion and the village you stopped at was of another persuasion. So people could end up being beaten twice or thrice between Parika and Breeden Hoop. It was terrible bloodshed during that time. So the police were deployed, particularly in that stretch between Stewartville and Metten-Meersarg. Many people were shot, many people were injured, and houses were burnt, razed to the ground by terrorists. You have to call them terrorists. These are not angry strikers. These are terrorists. These people were trained to commit terrorism. As Lenin said, Lenin, the father of the PPP's Leninism, the purpose of terror is to terrorize. That is what the PPP did, terrorize. And of course, even on the East Demerara, the police started to unearth large caches of weapons and ammunition. And the papers of the day would show you photographs. This is not fake. This is actual machine guns and ammunition which was seized from the PPP in 1964 about Triumph Village on the East Demerara. So we are into a very serious situation in which the police were deployed. Soon afterwards, the British Guiana Volunteer Force, which is a sort of reserve to the army. Of course, at that time there was no regular army um, in British Guiana. British Guiana did not have an army. The volunteer force was made up of people who volunteered. So their training was limited but effective. And these were hardworking people. Most of them had jobs, and they were embodied, which means that they were called out to serve. And this could only be done by a proclamation by the governor himself. The commanding officer couldn't call out the volunteer forces. We see sometimes, the army being deployed in all types of duties. In normal countries, the army is only deployed on the instructions of the highest authority when a state of emergency warrants the deployment. You don't call out the army, to disperse right. You call it the police force. That's what they're there for. They represent the civil power. In any event, the volunteer force was embodied. It simply means they were called out for service. But by then, the violence started to shift from the west coast Demerara to the east coast. So villages like Nonpareil and Bachelor's Venture, Betapawakting, Elmore. And you can look at the map and see that, the villages are sometimes divided by a canal, or what we call a trench. And these divisions had a very strong social and security implication between BB and Enmore, between Buxton, Annandale, and Nonpareil, Bachelor's Adventure. But we're not going to go into that now. And of course, the British Army is here. So in addition to the police force deploying its riot units, the volunteer force, the British Army. So by February, the Grenadier Guards, which is one of the, I'd say, more elite infantry regiments, the foot regiments, foot guards. Of course, you have the horse guards, you have the foot guards. But the Grenadiers are, part of the elite regiment. They participate in trooping the color and all that. So they were deployed here in Georgetown, and also the Devon and Dorset Regiment. In fact, between 1953 and 1966, you had over 18 British regiments. I think they used to come out mostly from Jamaica. Jamaica was a sort of hub. I think hub is the popular word now. Jamaica was the British security hub in the Caribbean. And so they could come out at quite short notice. They didn't have to come all the way from England. And they were called out to assist the British Guiana Police Force and British Guiana Volunteer Force to maintain law and order. And then you had the British Guiana Special Service Unit, which was really a part of the police force. Later on in 1965, it was dissolved, and its members were given the option of joining the Guyana Defense Force, which wasn't quite established by law until 1966, just before independence. But the governor, and the governor was very powerful in 1964, he signed an order establishing the BGSSU, and the first set of recruits came in October, 10th of October, 1964. The BGSSU, of course, is dissolved now, and they were dressed like, like the TSU, khaki, berets, but they had powers of arrest. They had powers. They were a civil force, not a military force. They were a civil force, and it was commanded by, police officers, and the ranks were, in fact, supervised by the Guyana Police Force right up to its termination in 1965. Now, I think we better come to the conclusion of this episode of the disturbances. The disturbances failed to achieve their objective. And my friends, I'd like you to pay careful attention to the words of a very prominent Guyanese historian. His name is Clement C. Charan. He actually won Escobar Medal for um, one of his publications on the sugar industry, sweetening bitter sugar. And you can read it for yourself if you want to see what Clem Citroen. It's a very thick book, but it's a very important book to understand what was going on in the minds of the members of the PPP. This is what he had to say. I mean, Clem Citroen is no friend of the PNC. He's no friend of, but this is what he had to say. He's on quarantine. He's very proud of his quarantine heritage. But he's a historian, well recognized, well regarded. Google the name, you'll see all his publications. And these are his words. He wrote that the Gao strike was the backbone. Sugar workers were the backbone in the PPP's campaign of violence on the estates. Backbone. Let me quote his words. Dr. Jagan exploited his considerable influence among Indian sugar workers to achieve political objectives, which had more to do with his control of the state than with their conditions of work. Oh, Professor Citroen is very unambiguous, very clear, very direct. Dr. Jagan exploited his considerable influence among Indian sugar workers to achieve political objectives, which had more to do with his control of the state than with their conditions of work. These are not the words of any PNC supporter. Professor Clem Citroen, is a respected historian. Citroen went on to describe the Gao strike as an orgy of arson, bombing, and personal attacks on people who refused to strike. He wrote soberly that sugar workers were pawns in the politics of sugar throughout Chetty Jagan's political career from the 1940s to the 1990s. Well. Citroen started his book Sweetening Bitter Sugar by speaking of Dr. Jagan as a fellow son of the quarantine, and he was proud to be from the quarantine as well. But this is what he said. He wrote soberly that sugar workers were pawns in the politics of sugar throughout Chetty Jagan's political career from the late 1940s to the late 1990s. That is literally from the start of Jagan's career to the end of Jagan's career. My friends, that is what the Gao strike was about, and I could not put it more eloquently than Professor Clem Citroen. The Gao strike was a campaign of intimidation and murder against workers who continued to work. Threats turned to murder, and ultimately, murder led to retaliation. Gao failed to gain recognition or convince the Sugar Producers Association and the MPC of the validity of its case. Its resort to violence, including arson, assault, battery, murder, sabotage, was unsustainable after the initial burst of terror. The British Army came down, the police came down on them, the volunteer force came down on them, the British Guiana Special Service Unit was mobilized. Civil society was alienated. Public opinion was outraged. Society was divided. Migration started seriously in 1964 because of the blows of the PPP and killing ordinary workers, many of them innocent, destroying property, was really the cause of the downfall of Gao. It was a murderous campaign, and it has damaged social cohesion in ways which have not healed, even after 60 years. The PPP has a lot to answer, and Gao's misuse and abuse of sugar workers really contributed to the division of society. We will continue to study the impact of Gao's violence on Guyanese society in our next episode of The Public Interest. Thank you, and may God bless you. Let us hope that we never again have a strike like the Gao strike of 1964, 165 days of terror.
Let us cooperate for the younger. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his